Okay, so I returned your graded discussion twos, and I thought I would go through it. I did the video already for the CTE that you need to be doing, so I'm doing this as a separate video just to discuss the discussion. And one of the things, I sent the email this morning, and I want to be sure we're all very clear on this. When you cite, you must use the page numbers, and you must use accurate page numbers. You can't just make up a page number to stick in there. And you need to be careful, even if you're not making up page numbers, that when you're citing, you're actually using the right page. I know that it seems problematic, but this is a big part of what the critical thinking is. It's being able to attribute to a source where you got the information and specifically where you got the information, not just some random set of pages that you're throwing in there so that I will be appeased. That's literally what is called academic fraud or academic dishonesty, and it carries the same weight as plagiarism does. So don't be doing that. If you haven't had time to read the sources, own it. Come back and do them in the peer comments. The grade will be lower because your top post won't have the critical thinking element, but at least you won't get a 0 for effectively giving me false or wrong information. So, all right, with that in mind, I want to talk about empires. This is the question. A big part of the conversation this week is about empires, the rise of some, the fall of others. What is an empire? Why are they important in history? What is the benefit of living in one? What is the downside of living in one? Do they exist today? And if so, how do they compare to those in this time period? Who benefits from empires and why? What effect do they have on the common person of the time and why? And when I say of the time, if you were actually used your textbook, then all of those chapters had to do with empires that existed in the 1600s. This is a map that I love, the Columbian Exchange map of well, they call it the 15th century. It's actually the 16th century because it's the 1500s. But notice the things that are coming and going from each specific place. I particularly like the gold-silver part, much of which is the focus of what Frankopan's talking about. The title of this chapter is the Road of Silver, which has to do with the movement of silver, not only into Western Europe, but then later in the chapter, out directly from the Western Hemisphere to Asia itself, principally into China. So this is by way of Manila in the Philippines. This is a big part of how the economics of the time are changing because suddenly they're expanding markedly as the Western European empires have figured out how to literally create more money. Now, of course, this is going to lead to massive inflation, and that's going to be basically the cause of the downfall of the Spanish Empire in the 1600s and early 1700s. It's going to have a big effect on other parts of the world as well, particularly in Asia. But for right now, this is creating wealth for Western Europe, which they're using in many respects to finance, as you'll discover this week, a lot of scientific expeditions to find more wealth. All right, so with that in mind, let us then go here. What is an empire? Okay, many of you told me something about what an empire is, but you didn't use citation, and you have to use citation because virtually no one gave me the definition off the top of their head. O'Neill, which many of you use because it was from Britannica, calls it a major political unit in which the metropolis, or a single sovereign authority, exercises control over territory of great extent or a number of territories or peoples through formal annexations or various forms of informal domination. Again, that's from Britannica. The Cambridge Dictionary, very similar to the Oxford Dictionary, calls it a group of countries ruled by a single person, government, or country. Ferguson, who was one of my personal choices for a multimedia source, basically defines empire as, in today's world, in short, is as much a world of ex-empires and ex-colonies as it is a world of nation-states, even though institutions which were supposed to reorder the world after 1945 have a distinctly imperial bent. For what else are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council if not a cozy club of past empires? What is humanitarian intervention, if not politically correct sounding version of the Western Empire's old civilizing mission? And we're not there yet. We'll get to this definition of what a civilizing mission is, and we'll get to the 1800s and imperialism and colonialism 2.0. But effectively what Ferguson is saying is that we still have empires today, and many of them are based off these old empires that theoretically collapsed after 1945. Westdod, who I also used as another um, multimedia source, says, "Today we are discovering that empire is truly in the eye of the beholder, with consequences that may be just as surprising as the construction of an independent U.S. or a Nigeria were for earlier generations." So these last two I bring in because they go to what I was using as a multimedia in the last set of questions, which is, are there still empires today? And as you can tell from these two guys, they argue that yes, they are. And that would be my argument as well. Yes, they are. They have changed perhaps in form, but definitionally they still exist, especially if that definition is, as I consider it to be, based on empires in both World Civ 1, World Civ 2, Western Civ 1, Western Civ 2, US 1, and US 2. All the survey courses, as well as Renaissance, Reformation, and um, the Scientific Revolution, um, in the history of revolutions also. These are all courses that I've taught and that I do teach. Um, my definition of an empire is a collection of different cultures, kingdoms, or political entities that have been brought together and controlled by an outside ruler, emperor, or empress, who dictate some forms of policy, usually having to do with trade or other economic matters, security, and taxes, within the individual polities themselves. What this effectively means is that you have a lot of different peoples coming together and being forced to work together for a select group of reasons by an external force. And that external force doesn't necessarily or always control everything going on in its individual components. It can, but it doesn't always do that. But it definitely controls things having to do with finances, security, and taxes. To continue my personal definition, sometimes the imperial ruling body allows the culture to keep its own habits and structures as long as it does what the imperial government wants. For example, the Mongol Khanates, which, if you were paying attention in week one, was the focus of the very first Frankopan that you read, which was all about the Mongols. And the fact that while they dictated some things, they basically left other things completely alone for the various groups of peoples that they conquered to do. One of the key ones, and I followed this in the second system, one of the key ones was religion, because for the Mongols, their personal religion was not one they could impose on anybody else, because it involved literally being from Mongolia, which many, in fact most, if not all of the areas they conquered, couldn't lay claim to. So they were very tolerant of other religions, other philosophies, other cultural practices. They were this way because they effectively wanted to keep their people happy and doing what they needed them to do, which was to supply them with soldiers for their armies, with taxes to finance their armies and to support their governments, and with trade, which also helped to finance their government. Other times, the imperial government dictates almost everything from religion to who can marry whom, or whom can marry whom, to where people can live. And this is a good example brought to us in this period by the Spanish Empire, who actively attempted to convert all the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere to Catholicism in order to counteract the loss of many Catholics to the Protestant Reformation. It was also a matter of trying to control the peoples of the Western Hemisphere that they captured. This would be similar to other places in the world. The Portuguese will attempt this in other places. Um, the British, not so much. The French, somewhat. They will missionize as well in the Western Hemisphere and in other areas that they take control of. So it really just depends on the empire as to whether this is a function of what they do when they control or not. All right, why are they important in history? A lot of this is what I know and what I believe from all the years I've been teaching this. One of the first and most significant is because they're the standard by which we discuss history and civilizations. If you start in any World Civ or Western Civ 1 or even US 1 or any course that's doing a long trace of human development, you start with civilizations because that's pretty much foundationally where up until the 1600s, literally, and that's the shift that we're seeing in our course now, the control of land was what produced wealth. Well, in the 1500s, and this is key to understanding what I'm talking about in this way cultures are changing, land is still central. It's the control of the Western Hemisphere, effectively by Western Europeans, and the taking of product from it, particularly during the Columbian Exchange, but also with the transfer of the plantation system ideology to the Western Hemisphere to mass produce cash crops. Among these, of course, sugar, coffee, eventually cotton, um, and also the extraction of gold and silver, which again, the big focus of the last two chapters in Frankopan has been on that extraction and how it changes the rest of the world. And we trace the development of societies in the modern world through a lot of this because it's with that sudden extra income and the shift that it brings to making trade preeminent as a mechanism for creating wealth that we get the modern world. Literally, that's why we refer to the 1500s as the start of the early modern world. It's literally the foundation that our present economy is based on and our present world systems. All right. Um, the second reason, because they often last longer than individual states or cultures. And you can look at Ferguson for this. The first part of his essay does a really good job talking about how long empires last. If you look at that as how we define the success of an empire, then a lot of that is because of longevity. The Chinese civilization that exists today traces itself straight back to those first three major dynasties back in the amorphous ancient period. The same can be said of long-lasting Western civilizations, Rome being one of the longest-running ones, either as first as republic, then as empire. But then many modern Western cultures still trace their existence to the Romans as well. Again, Ferguson does a really good job laying out some of these long ones. And you can look at even more modern ones, the Ottoman Empire that lasted almost 500 years. You can look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, several hundred years. Just depending on how you define what an empire is and what exists today, you can still look at that. Among the other things about why they're important, they spread culture, ideas, religions, technology, and many other human characteristics and structures. And this is not technology just in the sense of what we think of today. If you look at the evolution of the plow, it starts in China and spreads westward. The stirrup does the same thing, and these are back again during the ancient period, as we call it. Frankopan himself argues in pages 224 to 227 when he talks about the competition between the Portuguese and the Ottomans over goods and trade routes. And again on page 229 with the discussion of the Nua Taforia, the ship that became specially designed for the transportation of horses, which became a big part of the Portuguese wealth trade network. A specific example he gives on page 230, the Mughals brought new ideas, tastes, and styles with them, which he supports with his discussion of the miniature paintings of the Mongols and the Timurids, which become dominant as a status symbol among the Mughals and then spreads throughout much of not just Central Asia, but even into Western Europe. One of the reasons for longevity is because they often provide more stability and security for the people living in them, even though they don't always provide for a higher standard of living or individuality or choice. Because quite often empires can be repressive in terms of what people are forced to do, what positions they're forced to hold, and of course, how they're forced to live. All right, so the benefits of living in one, most of you kind of nailed this. In theory, safety from invasions if you're not living on the borders. And Frank gives us a good example when he discusses Akbar's conquest of what were known as gateway cities on his borders and the expansion of the Mughal Empire. This was on page 333. One of the other consistencies is knowing what is expected of you via taxes, laws, and social structure itself. You don't have to worry about whether you're going to do something stupid by accident. If you do something stupid, it's normally with some intention that's going to get you in trouble. I like to think of that also as the way I like to try to run the class. I try to lay out for you straight up front what you need to know and how you need to do things so that hopefully you won't do something out of stupidity or ignorance. Sometimes in some empires, the ability to practice your choice of religions. And again, the Mughals, the Mongols do this. Frankopan discusses this on page 222 when he comments, and I do like this, about the initial violence of the Portuguese exploration, but then says that attitudes to Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism quickly soften. And he compares that to the Crusades and the Crusader kingdoms that emerge, which aren't part of what we do in this course. But then he goes on, as a bluster was replaced by acknowledgement that a heavily outnumbered minority needed to establish a working relationship to ensure its survival. What he means by this is that those people at the top, in this case the Portuguese, had to pretty quickly come to terms with the idea that if they wanted to survive and they wanted to keep their empire working, they couldn't afford to piss off the people doing the work by trying to convert them or force them into Catholicism. So in many, particularly of the Asian and Southeast Asian areas that they conquer, they work insofar as they can with allowing local custom to continue as long as it's in large numbers. In smaller areas, they will attempt to convert to Catholicism, but in larger areas, they don't because they can't afford to lose it. And with that comes the idea of predictable government. Government has to find that fine balance of getting people to do the work and controlling them without leading them into open rebellion. Downside, lack of individuality and autonomy. You have to do what the empire wants. You have to conform to certain standards. Often higher taxes. And in this case, Westad from 2023 refers to the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, the Russians themselves were tired of empire and tired of the system that had produced it, and he's talking about the Soviet Union. Their country was losing the battle in Afghanistan. The non-Russian parts of the empire were troubled and disorderly, and policy at home seemed rudderless and vacuous. Thus, many Russians believed they had drawn the short straw within the imperial construct. Shops were empty, Russia was isolated, and people suspected that their country's vast wealth was being squandered on unnecessary wars and foreign subsidies. And this kind of speaks directly to what leads ultimately to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. You may want to come back to this when we get there, but a lot of it has to do with the disillusion of the Russian people themselves. The people at the center of empire were becoming very displeased with it. Other downsides, depending on where you were, you've got slavery. Frankopan has an interesting example on page 231 when he talks about the building of the Taj Mahal in India. Not without irony, one of the glories of India, the Taj Mahal itself, was the result of the suffering of Indians on the other side of the world, which I think that's a really interesting point in this particular chapter as he's talking about the excessive amount of wealth coming out of the Western Hemisphere, literally on the backs of the Native Americans and the transatlantic African slave system that was being put into place, but that it reaches so far as into India itself, and that is directly through trade. The Indians weren't getting it specifically from the Western Hemisphere, but through trade with Western Europe, they also were accruing a tremendous amount of wealth. Other downsides, forced conformity to the dominant culture's religion, social structure, behavior, dress, manners, etc. We'll see this in the later Mughal Empire, where the Mughals begin to become less tolerant of Hindu traditions. The veil, which we tend to think of as being associated with India today, was actually something that came in with the Mughals. It was not something that, it was not something that was part of Hindu culture itself. It came in as part of Islam. So a lot of interesting things that will become part of the structure of living in one, much of which is giving up one's own indigenous culture society. We see that definitely with the indigenous Americans and with a lot of other Asians as they become controlled by Western Europeans. All right. So how do the empires of this time compare? And this is kind of where we get into that historiography. And do we have empires today? I'm sorry, for some reason I lost the top part of this. Do they exist today? And if so, how did they compare to those in this time period? And by this time period, I mean the time period that we're doing in this course, in this week, which was literally the 15 and 1600s. So this is where I went to. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to make this smaller so we can all see it. This is where I went to looking for my sources for multimedia, because there you go. This is a big part of obviously what we're not talking about with Frankopan or with your textbook, the two other things you had required. So you kind of had to go to some outside sources for this, even though many of you didn't. Or if you did, you didn't cite them, which is not a good plan. So yes, I would argue that they exist today. So apparently would Ferguson and Westad and a number of others, based on the definition slide 1. Yes, the largest countries today, US, China, Russia, the European Union, influence trade and political structures all over the world. Westad argues today's Russian imperialism is fossilized and backwards looking, and he's basing this on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was written in 2023. China's leaders, on the other hand, imagine an empire that is closer to that of the United States, thus, in that sentence alone, acknowledging that China and the U.S. both are imperial structures. They see economic expansion at home as the key, enabling them to secure regional hegemony in Eastern Asia and use a mix of economic and military clout to handle their issues to their advantage further afield. The unprecedented economic growth of China has enabled its masters, at least in theory, to seek all of these aims at the same time. If you read farther into that paragraph, that is comparable to how he argues that the U.S. is doing it also. The biggest difference is that today, most empires do it through persuasion and economic dependency, particularly in trade, to influence other countries to do what they want. I probably couldn't give you a bigger or better example of this than the current administration's opening salvos about the imposition of tariffs, and that the negotiations on that started as early as the end of the election cycle itself in November. In the 1500s, while it was direct physical control of people and land, today it's about controlling trade in the terms of trade, which have a lot to do with also controlling the people, because people now and today determine their leadership, if they are in a democratic society, based on the wealth they can create from trade. If they are in a non-democratic society, they're looking more at, in the case of like the Chinese and the Russians, still trying to maximize their trade potential by the control of other societies. Continuing with that, empires today, Westad argues that while China aspires to modern empire, the U.S. is having an increasingly hard time deciding what kind of empire it wants to be. Again, an acknowledgement that we're an empire. The question is, what kind? There are similarities between the United States now and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Americans today are tired of mindless foreign wars, divided deeply at home, and given to believe that pie-in-the-sky politics will give them what they are looking for. Social divides are increasing, public goods are diminishing, and the industrial base is crumbling. The twin advantages that the U.S. has are the creativity of its technology sector and strength of its military. The question is whether the country will attempt to keep its global liberal hegemony in place under the Biden model, or become dedicated to a new authoritarian nationalism, the Trump model. And these are very good points. Again, this was 2023, before the election itself. From Ferguson, writing in hindsight of 2009, which is really kind of odd to be saying today, publicly the leaders of the American and Chinese republics deny that they harbor imperial designs. Both states are the product of revolutions and have long traditions of anti-imperialism. Yet there are moments when the mask slips. U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney's 2003 Christmas card asked, "And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" And the his, of course, in this would be God. In 2004, a senior advisor to President Bush confided to journalist Ron Susskind, we are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. We're history's actors." Similar thoughts may cross the minds of Chinese leaders. If they do not, it is still perfectly possible for a republic to behave like an empire in practice while remaining in denial about its loss of republican virtue. And this is the interesting duality that we find ourselves faced with constantly. When we get to Imperialism 2.0, we'll be talking about the imperialism of the United States during the period that in the U.S. Was referred to as the Progressive Era. And this would be the Teddy Roosevelt era that brought us into control of the Panama Canal, got us control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and several other territories. All right, so who benefits from empires and why? The people dominant in the culture, the rulers, and their friends, unquestionably. And in the 1500s, this is going to be not just the leaders of Spain and Portugal, and then later Britain and the Dutch and France, etc. It's going to be the merchants who are the people who are benefiting from being able to affect the trade. And they are slowly going to rule or rise up in the ruling elite as well. And in fact, when we get to the 1700s, one of the things you're going to see is that it's going to become these people, these merchants, the professional classes that arise to help protect them, like lawyers and artisans and architects and the like, who are going to be the ones who start demanding a say in government, which will lead to what we eventually refer to as democracy, which is how we get those twined together during the end of the scientific revolution and into the Enlightenment. This is all coming up in week 3 and 4, just so you know. Depending on how the rulers treat their subjects, some subjects benefit. And again, this comes with to a certain extent, the rise of the merchant class and a slight trickle-down theory from that, but also the idea of safety, security, some technology that's going to trickle down as well. In the 1500s, again, merchants, as I just mentioned, as these new empires were based off of trade, more so than the control of land, or begin to become based more on trade and the control of land. And that's the big segue point between Empires 1.0 and Empires 2.0. And then depending on the empire, religious leaders. In those empires that begin to demand conformity, such as the Spanish Empire, this will see a rise in the wealth of the central church, in this case, the Catholic Church. All right, so what effect do they have on the common person of the time and why? Which requires, again, addressing who is the common person. And as with the discussion last week, the common person is more likely to be the average person, who is that person who's in the majority of the society, and still, even into the 16 and 1700s, it's going to be someone involved in agriculture, someone involved in the production of goods somehow. As these empires become larger, though, it's also often going to be the conquered people, which means it's going to now encompass a large group of people that are enslaved or enforced labor to the conquering people. And by that, I mean not just Native Americans and African Americans, but as the Portuguese expand into Southeast Asia, it's going to become the colonized peoples there. We'll see the same thing with the Indians of Southeast Asian Indians, not Western Hemisphere Indians, who will also become eventually colonized and controlled by the British, who will then also move that platform into China as well. The effect they have on the depends on the rigidity of the ruler and their laws. In some empires, they have little effect. In others, like the Western European empires, they have a lot of control, often forcing religious conversion, demanding higher taxes, enslaving people, and generally worsening the quality of life, which is a big part of what we're going to see in Southeast Asia and in the older empires that will give way to the newer Western European empires, and their people will become subject to doing what those Western European empires want. This is going to move us in the segue period of the 1700s into colonization 2.0. All right, so source comparison of my sources. I didn't pick a particular textbook. I know them all pretty well. Most of them discuss trade with the rise of Western European empires and the Columbian Exchange, as well as the rise of Native American slavery, African and transatlantic slavery, and Asian slavery. They acknowledge the new empires created extreme levels of subjugation and the emergence of chattel slavery, the results of which we still deal with today. And that would be racism, that would be social economic and political inequality, even in modern cultures that profess to be trying to get past these. These things still exist. And they're all based on the chattel slavery that evolved in this period. That is not to say that slavery evolved in the 1600s. It didn't. It's been around for as long as there's been humanity. Chattel slavery, though, was a reasonably new form of slavery in terms of the idea of humans as property exclusively. Even slavery that had existed prior to that usually had some rights that the people deemed as slaves still had, not the least of which was that in most societies they still had the right to marry, they still had the right to have their children, and in most societies their children were not considered slaves when they were born. They were considered free. They also often had an option for people who were enslaved to earn money and buy their way out of slavery. Chattel slavery does not allow that. The status of a child is determined by the mother's status, certainly by the 1700s, which normally meant that any child, regardless of color, born to a woman who was a slave, whether African or native, was deemed to be a slave as well. The textbooks mostly view this as an explosion of wealth and a transitional period in society. You'll see this principally in the point that in this period there's a certain level of equality emerging between the rising European empires and the empires of Asia and Central Asia. Definitely a decline in the empires of the Western Hemisphere as they are effectively conquered and eradicated. Frankopan focuses most of Chapter 17 on the global dispersion of wealth, particularly silver, through the Columbian Exchange, which transforms Western Europe. It sees the rise of the Portuguese Empire, which utilizes its wealth to expand around Africa and into the Asian markets. He also begins to discuss the emergence of the Dutch and Central Europe. But the majority of the chapter is focused on how the Columbian Exchange impacts India, China, and the Ottomans. And his focus is on how this wealth changed these empires, setting them up in many respects to eventually become dominated by Western Europe. And this is actually kind of central in this chapter to understanding what's going to happen. His point, again, to go back to it, about the Taj Mahal being built off of the silver from the Western Hemisphere, is to lay the groundwork for you understand the shift here. That even though at this point in time, India and China and the Ottomans are benefiting from this wealth exchange with the Western Hemisphere, it's going to put them also beginning to become dependent on trade with Western Europe in order to maintain that standard. And that is that dependence that's going to eventually lead them into decline. So be sure you understand that that's a big part of what's going on with his chapter. Ferguson and Westad, again, which I chose because they are discussing modern empires and connecting them to the past. Ferguson is what is called a Western civilization's apologist. In 2011, he published a book called Civilization, the West and the Rest that basically argues why there's Western supremacy in the world today and how it's affected our telling of the story of history, as it were. But he puts it in concise form when he states, today's world, in short, is as much a world of ex-empires and ex-colonies as it is a world of nation-states. Even those institutions that were supposed to reorder the world after 1945 have a distinctly imperial bent, as in, despite the fact that we went for decolonization in the wake of World War II, which we'll talk about ad nauseum when we get there, that attitude about Western superiority still exists, and that today we call ourselves nation states as if that's better, as if to remove ourselves from this idea of imperialism, but the constructs of imperialism, particularly those based on economics, still very much exist. Westad argues, like Ferguson, empire in one form or another has always been with us and probably always will. From the Akkadians in the Middle East in the 24th century BC To the Americans in the same region 4,500 years later, contours of imperial domination have been significant types of government in all human history. Sorry, I didn't have this in here. There should be a, yes, there should be a quotation mark there to end that. And what he means by American presence there in the same region 4,500 years later is, of course, the Western presence or the U.S. presence in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Even though we're out of Afghanistan today, when this was written, we were still there, but definitely in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. He believes that modern empires are now regional. Today's Russian imperialism is fossilized and backwards looking. China's leaders, on the other hand, imagine an empire that is closer to that of the United States. They see economic expansion at home as the key, enabling them to secure regional hegemony in Eastern Asia and use a mix of economic and military clout to handle issues to their advantage further afield. Which is effectively, as I said, as you go on further in the article, what he argues about the U.S. It's now into regional imperialism, most of which is perpetrated by economic influence and control, and being able to leverage that economic influence by getting people to do what you want them to do by arguing to do things like increase tariffs to lower trade, which will hurt other people into doing what you need for them to do. His argument about the fossilization of Russian imperialism is based on the fact that, and again, this is in 2023, that Russia was still had invaded Ukraine and had not managed to conquer it yet. So his argument here, to a certain extent, is that military imperialism may now kind of be out the window, that it is more a matter of economic, with the military being used in complement to, and that's CECOMPLEM, as in to round out, or adjacent to, or as partnered with economic control or economic imperialism. All right, so there's my works cited. I'm encouraging you to look at it because notice the structure and form. Notice the Frankopan citation there. The Silk Roads, New History of the World, 2015, New York Vintage, because Vintage was the publisher. All of the rest of these are located online, as you know, and that is how you should cite them from online things. The New Statesman, where the Westad article was, is a magazine, as is Foreign Policy, where Ferguson's was. So you would cite the magazine first and italicize it the same way that you do a book title, and then the actual website, and then the specific location of the article itself. All right, so I think I covered everything that I thought was key in that particular discussion. I encourage you to watch this. And, well, obviously, hopefully, if you've gotten this far, you have watched this. But I encourage you to take to heart kind of the way that I structured this, because I tried to do it off of what the questions in the actual essay were. And for those of you who are actually copying and pasting the questions and answering under them, I think that's a really good way to do that, because that way you don't forget things. All right, if you have a question, feel free to email me and ask me. If there's anything about this that you particularly want to know, feel free to let me know that as well. I have already started looking at discussion threes, and I look forward to those as well.